Hi there, good afternoon.
Hi, Ellen.
Good to see you, Tracy. So everybody out there, hi, welcome. I'm talking this afternoon as part of the ongoing series about some things that could be helpful for election coverage to young journalists. Today I'm talking with Tracy Anne Sena, and she's going to be talking about some things to do with access to political officials and some suggestions about ways to best approach and talk with people who work in the political field and in the public view. So again, thank you for being here, Tracy. I really appreciate it.
Oh, you're welcome.
So I'm just going to give a very brief, for those of you who don't know Tracy, it just give you a little background on who she is and why she's here. And there is more that you can read about her below if you want to get some more details. So Tracy has been a long time. Her career has been in scholastic journalism education. She advised student media for 25 years in San Francisco. She is an award-winning advisor herself. She has been commended by multiple national organizations in journalism outside the classroom. Tracy is active in state and national journalism education. A particular interest of hers is student press rights, and she's been an advocate and a supporter and a help in those topics over the years. Um, she has since retired from the classroom, and she is currently doing work as a scholastic media consultant, and she's also a journalism mentor for new journalism teachers, helping them with their work. Have I got that right? Have I got most of the points here in your
Pretty
career?
much.
Well, as many of you know, Tracy is one of the leading lights in scholastic journalism, and she's done a lot on behalf of scholastic journalism in over decades. So she's here today because Tracy, as an advisor myself, I paid attention to Tracy's work because her students did something that I was trying to get my students to do. Tracy's students had a consistently successful and ongoing approach to covering social issues and politics, both at the local and national level for their student publications. And I know that Tracy encouraged this kind of viewpoint. She encouraged this kind of work. And she also had, her students had a high degree of success with the access and the kinds of reporting they were doing. So I asked Tracy to come here today to give some kind of tips to those who might be considering either doing this sort of work themselves as reporters, or to the educators who might be trying to encourage your students to get to this direction. So without much further ado, you ready to get going with this?
Let's go.
Okay. First, I'd love it if you would talk about why the work of covering the political process, whether it's your local school board or covering an election year like we're in this year in 2024, why do you think that kind of reporting is important to do at the high school level? I'm going to put the caveat in. I hear from a lot of teachers that I talk to that they're like, we don't do politics, and we're asked not to do politics, both in the school news site or in the yearbook. We just stay away from that. What would be your way of talking back to that about why that's important and where they should kind of anchor themselves?
Well, it all goes back to the First Amendment and the freedom of the press, which is enshrined um, in the Constitution with the very First Amendment. And with that, the reasoning behind that is that we live in a democracy, and in order for people to vote, they need to be informed. Okay. And so I know a lot of administrators will argue, well, they can watch the news and they can get it from the news. And the fact is, our students don't watch cable news. They don't watch network news. They go to other sources, usually TikTok. I would like to give them a more authoritative source and more a source which they can relate to, and that's their peers. And so when students do accurate, fair reporting, really looking at an issue, reporting on both sides, reporting on this candidate, but also that candidate, or in a big field. I mean, we're past primary season, but in the primaries, all the candidates looking at that, they can speak to their peers uniquely in a way that all these other media organizations can't. So that's the big reason why the student press needs to get out there. They need to do it for democracy. And even though not all of our students are voting yet, in fact, a very small fragment of our students are voting, anywhere from 1/8 to 1/4 in most schools, we have a bunch of students who will be voting in, 2 or 4 years. I mean, in 4 years, all of them will be voters, but they can also become involved in the political process right now, by volunteering to work on different campaigns or on different initiatives or against different initiatives. Or they could also become poll workers. And these are all things which the student press can report about and advocate for their student body to do.
I think you're bringing up several points that I just want to kind of touch back on for a second. You talked about the potentially administrator or even a kid in the classroom. I've heard students say this to me: why should our publication cover the news when we can go to CNN, or we can go to MSNBC, we can go to Fox News, we can go to a various news outlet ourselves? And I tell them that that's the very answer of why they should be covering it themselves. Because if there was only supposed to be one outlet covering things, we'd all go to one single outlet. Every single professional media organization is covering the political process every single day of their news cycle right now. They're not going, oh, let's look over to our neighbors here or our neighbors there. They're like, we have people who pay attention to us. We want to be there for the news. And that is what a school publication is for its audience. You are the publication of record for your audience. So you should be covering this. There is something that you touched on that I think also needs expansion when you said reporting on all sides. I think that so often when people hear political coverage, they think it's opinion coverage, and it's not. These are news events. These are newsmakers coming to your community or a community near you, or saying things about topics that are germane to your population. That means that is telling you this should be covered as a news piece. We're not talking necessarily about opinion columns and editorials. We're talking about actually covering the news, what people said, when they said it, how they said it, attributing quotes, right? Would you agree with that as the kind of
Well,
coverage?
I would agree, and I would add, a strong publication should not be publishing opinion pieces unless they are doing fair reporting,
Yes.
which is explaining the larger issue with it. Because, in 400 words, yes, you're meant to sway opinion in an opinion piece, but you really need to give readers a fact. An educated electorate needs to see the big picture, and they're not seeing that in an opinion piece.
And you're also bringing up the point that the peers on a school paper are the ones that you trust. I mean, there can be professional
Right.
reporters out there. There can be TikTok influencers who are fun, but you know the people on your school newspaper staff. So when they're going out and doing the reporting, you actually have a link, a connection to them, even if they may not be your best friend, but you at least know who they are, and you know that you're going through the same experiences in high school together, right? So
Well,
I think it's
Ellen, with that, if I can interrupt, the student press should not be just regurgitating what you're going to see in the professional press. The student press should be talking to their student body about why this matters to you.
mhm.
Why does this matter to our community? How will this affect our readers or our families or me in the future? So that's the real angle that the student press needs to take. How will it affect us?
Yeah. And that may involve quite a bit of, for want of a better word, a little bit of homework on the part
A
of each
lot of
staff,
homework.
because your school and where it's based is going to be different than the school that's 500 miles away in a different environment. So actually kind of sifting through that, I know my students did a lot of work with that, as yours did too, about what is specific to us in our kind of setting that we want to find out more from those who might represent us. You also said earlier that even though an eighth to quarter of the students at your school may be voting in this election cycle, 100% of the students in the school are going to be voting later on, right? We hope 100% will be voting
Within
later
4 years.
yeah, and I think this gets lost in the shuffle because um, I think so often we think of students as magically at 18, you become this adult person in America and you're supposed to, and then that's when you start exercising your rights. The US Constitution and court cases that have involved high school students have said, you are a US, if you are a US citizen, you are a US citizen when you're born. You hold those rights, they're not given to you. You hold them. They are part of your existence in this particular place and time. And I think that it's really important that the press does its work on behalf of the students at their school, on behalf of the democratic process before they turn 18. So I think really what you were saying, I'm just amplifying and agreeing. So you have had a track record of having your students, and by the way, let me just specify a little bit. You were teaching at a private school in San Francisco, which happened to be an all-girls school, and then also in parts, as your career went on, you were teaching at the boys' school, you were teaching middle school, but I think you are very much associated with the Broadview as kind of your legacy publication. And your girls were really good about getting access to candidates, access to events, and doing that work. Can you talk about the students who've obtained press credentials over the years and tell us a little bit about that?
Oh, gee. They have done absolutely everything from the hyper local to national. So one year we had like 12 people running for mayor of San Francisco, and our publication interviewed every single person so
Wow.
that we were able to do a bio on I mean they, I was not doing it, so that they could write a bio about every single person and why their candidacy mattered.
Mhm.
Okay, so hyper focusing that. I'm going to add here that one candidate that one year would not was not returning phone calls, and we'll talk about this a little bit more. They kept calling, and finally I said, why don't you just call back and say, I want to give you one more chance because we're getting ready to go to print, and we have every single person running for mayor except for this one person, and we don't want to run, declined to comment. So
Did you
little
get
bit of
them?
a threat in there, but also the truth. The next
Mm.
day, that candidate appeared on our campus for an interview.
Oh, that's a great story.
He said he was in the neighborhood, but the student got pulled out of class, and I
Oh,
mean, it
that's
was
great.
unannounced. But they will do that. So okay, so hyper local initiatives for the city and county of San Francisco. We might talk about that. And this is another thing too with covering politics. You're not going to be able to cover anything, everything, because it's just too much. So focus on those few initiatives or those few candidates that are really going to have an effect on your student body, and really focus on that. And then your publication can give references, like the League of Women Voters or other places where you can do more research. But focus on just a few. Don't try to do everything with that.
You mentioned making sure that resources are mentioned, and I think that sometimes also gets forgotten in doing news
Mhm.
coverage and thing that part of the role of the student publications is the role that the professional publications have, which is to inform your community of how to get involved, where to find out information about how to get involved. You mentioned that people could volunteer to be poll workers.
Right.
So that would imply that there should be either a sidebar or
Mhm.
a little thing at the end of a story that says, if you're interested in becoming a poll worker, here's the information to get to it, or talking to a poll worker and then putting the resources at the bottom. That's really a big deal. You talk about hyperlocal, and I know that you were talking about the mayor's race, which is sort of the higher version of hyperlocal. We were talking before this recording started about the current importance of high school journalists right now in covering things that are even more hyperlocal, like school board meetings, because
Right.
that local politics absolutely affects what's going to happen at your school year over year. And it's not really cool, groovy coverage. It's not exciting to sit in a school board meeting late at night and listen to people talking and talking and talking. But that's actually where the day-to-day changes that are going to affect your very real life are going to happen in a school. And we can't rely anymore. You can't expect in your community that there's some professional reporter who's going to do it for you. As we're seeing the emptying out of professional newsrooms, in many communities, the only living press is sitting in a high school classroom. That is where the reporters are. And so there's a little bit more, I think, urgency on right now for our young reporters to look around and say, who's telling these stories for our community, whether it's about the mayor's race or the school board or even some national coverage, if you don't have a professional news outlet in your community, right?
Right.
So can you talk about your students did this local coverage and they were able to interview mayoral candidates, and I think they've also interviewed other kinds of candidates. Can you talk about some of the other? I'm thinking
They
of
have,
some.
you know, I'm going to preface this by saying, being in an urban area, and especially San Francisco Bay Area, um, candidates came through for the money train, essentially. So we always have had political candidates coming through the Bay Area, and my students would travel to go see those candidates. So in order to do that, they would register with the local political committees as the press. And easy to do that. Go to the local website of the Republican National Committee, the Democratic National Committee, and scroll down on that page, look for the menus, and find the area where it talks about either press or media. And many times you can sign up right there.
It's usually a
They will,
form, right? There's a form.
it's an online form. Some, depending on where you are, it may not be there. And so there will be a phone number. And so call, make the cold call. I am, a member of Name Your Publication, and we want to cover so-and-so, and he or she is in town. And how do I get credentials for that event? And if you have to leave a voicemail message and they don't get back in 24 hours, then you call again. If there's an email address, the info at, AZDNC or whatever, email them. 24 hours, they should be getting back to you. And if they aren't, you've got to persistently pester with that. And, the big thing, one of my students was, had credentials to cover a presidential inauguration. And it was very difficult for her to get those credentials. She sent a whole press packet of everything that she had been to with pictures of all of her credentials that she had been covering locally, literally for 2 years. And then she called for credentials every single day for 32 days. And on the 32nd day, it was a he said, you know, you have been so persistent with this. How can I not give you credentials? And she had access to all sorts of events in which she was able to take her camera. Actually, she got 2 press passes, which was even cooler than what we expected. So persistence pays off. And if you show you're really serious, you're going to get into these events.
Now, I know that, and I know the student that you're referring to because that student went on to become the National Student Journalist of the Year. Is that correct?
Right.
And
Yeah.
a great deal of her portfolio submission included these photographs that she had gotten through persistence. And I do want to come back to this because I think what I hear a lot when I'm talking to both my own former students or the students I'm working with now, they'll say, well, who do I have my mom call? Is it somebody that you know, Ms. Austin or Ms. Sena, that could call? And I think there's this idea that somebody will just hook me up with the information. Do you think that's the best practice? Like, oh, let's see who I know who can know the person, or what do you encourage?
Well, I will go back to this same student who now has, a very large up and coming company of her own. And she says that making those cold calls prepared her for business. So if we're talking about giving students agency, which is something which scholastic journalism does really, really well, it's one of those soft skills that's not going to show up on a standardized test, but it is a tool for success in life, regardless of what you go into. students need to do it. Students need to do it. You know, sometimes there may be a connection to, you know, somebody who knows somebody, then the student needs to use their connections, you know, to, just as the professional press, you know, has their whole list of people that they know, and they get connections into things sometimes. But the students need to do the work. It should not be because the school has connections with a particular political candidate or a political person. Student needs to go out there and get those interviews, get those credentials on their own.
I think it's important for those students to remember you're creating the connections. You're going to be the person with the connections, because when you make the phone call and you keep following up and you spend 3 days, 10 days, 15 days, 32 days, you're going to be building connections with these political officials. And I'm going to share, if I may, a story with one of my former students who kept running into a candidate at political events, and he would stop and ask that political candidate, who was more local than national, but was at some of these larger events. He would stop and do a quick interview with that candidate. And over time, it's like that candidate was used to hearing from this young man. And eventually, about 6, 8 months later, he reached out, my student reached out on behalf of the staff and said, could you do a sit down with us to talk about issues that are important to us in our area? And that candidate, who is now a leading congressman, sat down at a Panera for like an hour and answered questions about what were important. And I don't think that would have happened just out of the blue, but because there was an established connection and an established history of, I've met you, I've seen you do I've seen you interview me, I've seen what the results of the interviews are. You are keeping your agreements as a young journalist with me. I think that candidate felt more confident that sitting down with a group of high school journalists was going to be something that he was willing to give time in a very busy political life to. You've talked about registering that. So let me go back to the resources. You've said starting points, go to the local campaign websites for the RNC and the DNC. Look somewhere, it could be in the about at the bottom, it might be a tab at the top. Look for press or media inquiries and fill out the forms. Also then do that, also call and keep calling, because especially at this point in the election year, everybody's up to here with busy, and we'd like them to get back to you in 24 hours. Let's face it, the odds are right now that with everything going on, that a lot of political officials and their campaign workers may need a few calls, as you were saying, to get to it. Can you go forward a little bit with something that I think is important to remember before we get to credentialing and what should happen after that? What about that government issued ID that they're going to probably need if they're doing some of this? And how long? I remember a student said, oh, this was when I was in Minnesota. He was like, oh, I want to go cover the president or vice president is going to be flying into Minnesota tomorrow. And I said, good luck with that. You're not going to get Secret Service clearance overnight.
You know,
so can you talk about the time frame for this, that you might having a little bit more time horizon?
Well, it would have been nice to have started this yesterday.
Yeah.
But start today. Start today. And if you don't have a government issued ID, you are probably not going to get, and by government issued ID, I mean either a state driver's license or a state ID card
Or a passport.
or a passport. Those are the big ones. So unless you have those, you know, especially after an attempted assassination attempt on one of the presidential candidates, security is even tighter than ever. So you've got to start now. For the press area, yeah, they're gonna check things. It may be a Secret Service check. It depends on the arena. So you need to have that. For the lower political candidates, and by this I mean super local, members of Congress, depending on where you live, you may still need a state ID. Depending on, well, you know, Gabby Giffords wasn't a well-known political candidate before a congresswoman before she was shot. So, you know, I think everyone is being really wary about who gets access to them this way these days. So you may need more than a student ID. So unfortunately, this may preclude some of your freshmen and sophomores from being able to get into events, but they can cover the local events. So
Let's
you
come
know,
back to some things. So in
okay,
addition to the IDs, I just want to get back to the point of allow more time. I think it's really important if you're an educator watching this, or you're someone who is advising student journalists in some way. Um, it's pretty common for kids not to have a long time horizon. Something that's happening this week is pretty long time. So if you're looking at, and we are now entering the fall of an election year, and the days are closing to election day. So if you're thinking that a student might want to try to, or you're the student and you think you'd like to do this, what Tracy just said would have been nice to start yesterday, but definitely start today, and don't tarry. Get on it,
yeah,
because it is not going to usually happen in 24 hours or even 2 days or 3 days. It might take a week or 2 weeks, and the days are then going to keep going. So you want to get that credential for these things that are important, and you take those credentials really seriously. Just, I think it goes without saying, but I am going to say it. If you are credentialed for these events, it is next level security. You don't give that credential to somebody. You don't say, "Oh, I can't
yeah,
go, you take it." That credential is like a passport for you. It belongs to you. You're the only one that can use it. There's a check-in place when you go into these events where you're showing your credential. People can ask to see your credential as you're moving through the space. So really take that seriously. And yeah, and you probably want to save those credentials as souvenirs of a time in your life. Once the students have credentials, so they do reach out to the political organizations and they do get credentialed to attend. Usually a credential is issued for an event. It's not for a
mhm,
season. A credential is kind of like a concert pass. It's a credential
right.
for this event on this day, and it has a certain look to it. What are they supposed to do with that credential when they get it in hand? And then what should happen when they're preparing? So let's just talk about the physical credential very
Okay.
briefly. Very
So the
briefly. You have a credential, what do you do with it?
Well, you won't have a credential. You will be on a list for a credential. So the big thing, when you get the email or you get the phone call that says, yes, you are on the list, then you need to say, where will the press table be? Or where will the press entrance be? And then you will need to check in. And so, talk a minute about the things you need to bring, but I'm going to tell you right now, think TSA about the things that you should and should not bring with you. So you need to show up at the press office. You will present your passport or your government issued ID. They will give you a credential on a lanyard. You wear it around your neck and it stays on there the entire time with that.
So getting these credentials is a really big deal. And once you get the access to a credential and you pick up your credential, there's a step that happens before you travel to the place, and that's going to be preparation. What kind of preparation should a student journalist do if they have gotten access to an event that's going to happen?
Okay. Often the whoever's issuing the credentials will give you a list of what the agenda is for the day, and it will always say subject to change. So the reporter should know who's going to be there. And so if anyone who's on that list, know who that person is and what they look like. And by doing a little research to know a little bit about them, if you get the chance encounter to ask them a question, what would you ask that person? So you really have to have a sense of what's going on that day. Um, there's more to that, but
Okay. The part about what do they look like, I know from talking to some of the advisors and students who just covered the convention in Illinois, they took that advice that you gave about you should know what they look like. They created a photo bank of all of
Mhm.
the local, and so local in Chicago and then statewide and the national candidates, and they created a Google Drive where they could look on their phone to see what somebody looked like, so that they had a better chance when they were on site. Like, oh, I see that. Oh, that's a person I should go talk to. And then they knew the person's name. So that's really good advice, not only to see what their names are, but to make sure you have a visual reference, because people do pop into these events that you might not be expecting.
Mhm.
And if you're at an event, is it okay to walk up to people and talk to them if they're not at the podium?
It depends. So, and this is where you really need to read any information which you're given from the press office for the event. Sometimes the press is cordoned off into a little area and you cannot leave that area. And so you really need to respect that, or you may be thrown out of the event. Sometimes you're allowed to roam through, and you can. You can always catch people outside the door, but depending on the event, once you go in, maybe you can't go out. So you need to prepare for the eventuality of that. You may be there a long time before you see their candidate. So can I talk a little bit about what they should bring?
I'm so sorry, Tracy. I grabbed the wrong button and hit pause, so please forgive me. I think I think the question we were coming at is you were going to speak about the practical tips to reporters as they're going in, what they should be bringing with them, what they should have, what they should be preparing for. Can you speak to that?
Sure. Number one, reporter's notebook and a pen, actually pens, because remember, sometimes electronics go wrong, and sometimes you just need to jot something down really quickly. Of course, your phone. I always recommend that students have a power bank with them so that if their phone goes down, because they're going to be using it a lot, especially if there's downtime and they just want to text their friends during the downtime, they need to have a backup power source for that. The camera, if you've got a long lens, by all means bring it, because you will probably need it. If you have an extra body, or your staff has more than one camera, bring both cameras and put a long lens on one and put a short lens on the other, so that you can swap back and forth rather than having to change lenses. Bring extra SD cards. And I always recommended to my students, because bad things happen to good people, which means sometimes SD cards go bad and you can't recover them. Do half your shooting on one card and then at some point switch and do the other one, and go back and forth if you need to, so that you aren't putting all of your
Mm,
eggs in one
it's a
basket
good
with
idea.
that.
Mhm,
Have extra batteries for your phone.
mhm,
Bring snacks, because you may be there a while. Candidates are notoriously late, or they may go over their allotted time slot, or someone else may, but you may be there for a while and you may get hungry. I would suggest that you bring a water bottle with and you may have to dump out all the fluids. It depends. So be prepared to do that and refill it once you get inside. But also be careful with consuming water, because if you need to take a break, you may miss, your big opportunity to get the picture that you wanted or see the candidate that you wanted. So, think about these things, but be prepared to know that you're going to be there for a while.
mhm.
With that, you know, I'm big into emergency preparedness. So, if you are going with another staff member, have a plan. If we get separated, where are we going to meet later? Or are we going to go home on our own? Or how do we check in with each other? Also, know where emergency exits are. So, and that's just good practice for anywhere you go, have a plan, think about worst scenario. Sorry, but that's kind of where we are right now.
Mhm.
But plan. But think about those things. It's easy to walk into an event and, be so starstruck. You really have to focus your mind and think about, okay, why am I here? What are the pictures I need to get? What are the sound bites I need to get? What is the video I need to get? So plan, plan, plan. Have a plan for your day. Have a plan for everything that's happening. Um,
Good advice.
just one more aside. When you get there, as soon as you get into that press area or you get inside, get out your tools. Be ready to report from the moment you get on site, and don't put your tools away until you're actually outside and leaving. And even then, you might want to think about holding on to at least your phone in case somebody comes out at the last minute to get a picture. You don't know where the news is going to happen. You don't know where your video is going to happen or your soundbite. You can plan, but things change at a moment's notice.
On the day of the event, I think you're already talking about some of those things. What do you suggest? We did leave off one thing that you and I always think about, which is comfortable shoes. Make sure you've got shoes is really important, especially for those who are fashionistas out there. This is not the time to wear your really cute shoes that give you blisters. You're going to be getting, I heard from the kids who were at the Illinois thing, they were doing 10,000, 15,000 plus steps. I've heard that from my students who covered things in California. So think in terms of you're almost like at a track event in terms of foot comfort. But the day of the event, when you get there, what do you suggest doing? You said get your tools out, but where do they go? Where should they be?
Well, that's what you're going to find out when you check in. You know, do
Okay.
you have access to the floor, or is there a cordoned off press area with that? So first of all, get there early, because the professional press often has, especially large news organizations, may get the choice spots, and it will actually be taped down on the floor. This is for, and then the name of the media organization. So minor press organizations, sorry, student press, but that's where you fall, may have to shuffle for all the leftover scraps of pieces. So you want to be in the front, especially if you are not rather short of stature. So get there early. It also gives you a chance to get a lay of the land. If there's professionals there, it's fine to ask them, can I stand here? Is this the best place? And I've got to tell you, the professional press has been incredibly generous with my students, because they introduced themselves, they asked pertinent questions, and then they left them alone. So there was one event, it was in Washington, D.C. One of my students told me she got a great close-up picture of Nancy Pelosi, who's being inaugurated as Speaker of the House. And all the press was way in the back of the room. And then someone came up and said, I want all the San Francisco press. So, you know, the San Francisco Chronicle and the Examiner and Mercury News, they were all going. Because my student had introduced herself to the photographer from the San Francisco Chronicle, he grabbed her and said, come on, kid,
Oh,
you're
that's so great.
local press.
That's
So
great.
she got this fantastic shot that all the people in the back of the room couldn't get. So I also have a picture of that same photographer showing my student how to use certain settings for the low light. So ask pertinent questions, but also remember that they are in the office. So beyond the little pleasantries and the very basic questions, leave them alone. Some reporters will be pre-writing stories because they will have that agenda. They know pretty much what's going to happen, especially stump speeches. If you go to enough stump speeches, and I have, you know what they're going to say. You know, watch them on YouTube. You know what the next one is going to be. So they're pre-writing those stories and getting them ready. So you really have to respect those people who are in the office. If you are up on a press dais, if you have to move around, walk slowly, because they wiggle. And if someone is taking video and they've got their camera there on a tripod and this starts happening, you're going to have a lot of ticked off people. So walk carefully, walk slowly, and walk low so that you aren't getting in anybody's camera frame. Um, what else? Also, while you're there, remember you are there as a reporter, so you need to be nonpartisan. And you know, the person that you think should be the next president of the United States, you may be there. You can't, if it's your guy or your gal, you can't cheer. So don't go in there with any political gear, you know, dress the part of a reporter when you're in there. Don't have campaign buttons, you know. As you're leaving, of course, you're going to want memorabilia. Do it discreetly. put it in your backpack, put it in your bag, but don't show partisanship while you're there because that erodes it.
It
Yeah,
includes with your
just
reporting questions, right?
excuse, and
That
your
also
reporting.
includes with where you're reporting.
Yeah, exactly. Because if you're doing those things, you're coming in with a mindset. So it really, you have to have your reporter mindset when you're in there, and that I'm covering the event. I have to put up aside. And so that's why even with the notebook, taking down, the crowd, the size of the crowd, all those details, anything that you notice, get that down. But you are a reporter above all.
Um, I wonder if you want to just come back to any of these things. I think the advice you've given is super helpful. You've both given from the high level of how to think about it and to finding access to credentials, and then actually the practical advice of how do you do the work you need to do, the nuts and bolts stuff. Thank you for that. Is there anything else that you'd like to say to either the Scholastic Journal educators or the young reporters who are trying to do this work? You've had so much experience with this. What else would you like to tell them?
Well, it's really have the press mindset. And with that, you are the press. You have a right to be there. You have an obligation to be there to report for your community and to your community with that. And that's a privilege. That is a real privilege. And so you really need to work hard to get it right, regardless of how you feel. And actually, maybe your mind will change in the process by really taking that neutral stance and looking at propositions or candidates or initiatives through different eyes, through a different lens, and force yourself to do that. Um, yeah, be fair, be accurate, work against your own bias. And it's hard to do. It's really, really hard to do. And unfortunately, what we're seeing too much now in the professional media is we're seeing pundits who are talking about their guy or their gal. And instead of talking about the whole situation neutrally and, turn on any of these cable stations right now, and you know that the bias is there. It's so obvious. Rise above that. Rise above that in your reporting. And this is what happened.
And with that, I want to thank you so much for spending the last minutes here of talking about how reporters can get credentialed, how they can show up and be prepared, and some practical tips for what they need to do. Your advice was really helpful. Thank you again, Tracy. I really appreciate it.
You're welcome.